welcome to this seminar, which is a joint seminar, Department of Social Policy and CASE, Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion. CASE is a research centre here at LSE with very strong links to the department. And we normally have our own seminar series, which is on Wednesdays at 12 o'clock. So if anyone's interested in being on the mailing list for that series, please, or would like to know more about CASE, please do get in touch and let me know. We've been operating for 25 years plus, working on issues to do with poverty and social exclusion and multi-dimensional inequalities, primarily in the UK, but also in other countries around the world. So this is a joint seminar, and we're delighted to welcome Zach Parolin to give the talk today. So Zach is Professor of Social Policy, Inequality and Opportunity at the University of Oxford, and Director of the Economics, Inequality and Opportunity Programme at INET Oxford, and Professorial Fellow at Nuffield College. And that's only been at Oxford since September. Before that, he was at Bocconi for several years. Before that, at Columbia. Before that, he did his PhD in Antwerp. So he's been crisscrossing across the US, and he's done a huge amount of work over that time on measurement, causes, and consequences of poverty, inequality, and social mobility in the US and in Europe. But today he's going to talk to us about the intergenerational persistence of poverty in the United States.
Great, thanks for the introduction, and really thanks to all of you for making the time to be here. Today I'm going to present some new work on a topic that I've been thinking about in various capacities over the last 2 or 3 years. So I've presented on intergenerational poverty a couple times, and some of you have probably seen a version of a different paper with a similar title. This presentation is really going to focus on understanding conceptually and statistically what is the intergenerational persistence of poverty. How should we distinguish this measure from other mobility measures that we might use or care about, say using rate slopes to understand mobility across the income distribution, or using your intergenerational earnings or income elasticities to summarize for a country the extent of social mobility. How is the measure I'm going to talk about today different from those? And to be provocative for a moment, I'll even put forth the claim that I'm going to try to convince you that we should care a lot more about this measure than the traditional mobility measures that we often use. That's the claim I'm going to put forth and try to convince you of. But what I'm then going to do is understand, what does intergenerational poverty look like in the United States? How does the US compare briefly to other high-income countries? But perhaps more importantly, how has the US made any progress in reducing the intergenerational persistence of poverty in the last 30 or 40 years? If it has, why? If not, why not? And again, how do we get into the weeds of understanding what the US could do if it wanted to actually reduce the extent to which, let's say, poverty during childhood is associated with poverty in adulthood? This is the outline of the talk. Believe it or not, we're going to do this in 45 minutes. So we'll talk about what is the intergenerational persistence of poverty, how do its properties differ from other mobility measures. So statistically, what's underpinning this measure that you need to keep in mind when we talk about the concept. How does the US compare to other high-income countries? On that part, I'm just going to show one figure, because that's the focus of a separate paper. It's already in the public. Fourth is really the new part of a lot of this. Looking at trends in the US over the last 40 years on how intergenerational poverty has evolved. And finally, what I referred to earlier, how could the US actually make progress and reduce it? So to start to understand this concept, I'm going to present a relatively simple visual. And the visual is this. This is one person's mobility journey. On the x-axis for now, we're just putting percentiles of the income distribution. You can change that to real income levels if you want. It's not important for now. We're going to draw an arbitrary poverty line here at the 20th percentile. We'll make that less arbitrary later when we talk about poverty measurement. And this blue dot is going to represent the person's parental income rate, in this case, when they were born. So this person was born to parents who had income around the 10th percentile of their respective distribution. We're going to call that being born into poverty, or experiencing poverty during childhood. And the end of this arrow is where this particular person ends up. So in this case, around the 70th percentile of the income distribution. This would clearly be a case of upward mobility from poverty, right? They were born to parents with very low incomes. in this individual's own adulthood, they did quite well. They're in roughly the top quarter of their respective income distribution. If we were to look at a country of 5 individuals and look at each person's mobility journey and try to come up with a summary indicator of social mobility in this country, typically the way we would do that is to, let's say, log parental income, log their own income in adulthood, regress these on each other and call that an intergenerational earnings or income elasticity, depending on the concept. We might actually use ranks and just regress ranks on ranks to get what we might call the rank slopes. And a lot of these measures, to generalize for a moment, are given a lot of weight to people who are doing relatively well at the start and perhaps experiencing mobility up and down the bottom half of the income distribution. In other words, those in the red box right here. But to summarize before we get into a more formal definition, when we talk about the intergenerational persistence of poverty, we are going to give a lot of weight to these individuals. And not just these, but also whether individuals born above the poverty line are falling below as well. So we're going to be less interested in upward and downward mobility in the upper half of the income distribution, despite often the large influence of the individuals in this red box in traditional mobility measures. And instead, we're going to give heavy weight to understanding upward mobility from poverty. And this will be a relative measure, so also the likelihood that individuals born above poverty are coming back down below the poverty line in their adulthood. That is a simple way of describing this, but let me get into some more formal definitions. The intergenerational persistence of poverty is the association of one's poverty status during childhood and their poverty status during adulthood. You could vary this in different ways. Maybe you want to focus on the parents' poverty status when the parents were between ages 35 and 40, that's fine. But for short, we'll just call it parents' poverty status based on your parents' income when you were a child and your own poverty status in adulthood. It's quite simple to measure. In the simplest form, this is poverty in adulthood, post-tax transfers, what that post represents here. Child poverty is represented here, and beta 1 is the association of the extent to which you were poor in childhood and the extent to which you were poor in adulthood. This is the way that we're going to measure this in, let's say, the simplest of terms. Why should we care about this measure? I'm going to skip over all of these intrinsic or normative concerns that we might have for caring about any measure of social mobility or inequality of opportunity or other metrics. I really want to talk about why should we care about this measure compared to other mobility metrics that you might be familiar with. And in this talk, I'm going to elaborate on each of these points. So I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly now, but we're going to return to all of these. I'm going to show you that the intergenerational persistence of poverty measures 2 things at once. It measures material concerns, such as the level of poverty among the adults that we're looking at, but it also includes these fairness considerations that are often inherent to mobility measures, and that it also captures the relative persistence between childhood and adulthood poverty, independent of adulthood poverty rates. And I'll clarify that in technical terms in a little bit. But for now, keep in mind 2 things. We're measuring 2 main components with this measure: are adult poverty rates and the relative persistence between childhood and adulthood poverty. A nice feature, I think this is a nice feature of this measure, is that if there is no poverty in the adulthood period, there is no intergenerational persistence of poverty. The measure will fall to 0 if poverty is eliminated, and that is not true of typical rank slopes or intergenerational income elasticities and more. We are not going to focus on positional rank. We are going to argue that income is the right metric to understand. If we care about, let's say, the efficacy of taxes and transfers in reducing intergenerational poverty, then that would not show up in typical measures of rank slopes or positional ranks. It will show up when we use a concept focused on income. And by measuring poverty, we are going to focus on household income, inclusive of taxes and transfers most of the time in this talk. That differs from other landmark papers in this field. So, the work coming from Opportunity Insights on where is the land of opportunity is primarily focused on rank slopes. They do have some estimates based on intergenerational income elasticities as well. And again, the measure that I'm going to talk about today just differs fundamentally from some of the properties of what you would see in that paper. The intergenerational persistence of poverty recognizes nonlinearities in upward mobility. I can talk about that later. If interested, there is a lot of work using IGEs that do recognize that now, but generalized, we can say it's partially different from some of the older work in this literature. We're going to heavily weight upward mobility from poverty. This is different if you're familiar with another terrific Opportunity Insights paper on the fading American dream that measures absolute income mobility. The takeaway from that paper is that absolute income mobility in the US is declining since 1940 onward. If you get into the weeds of that paper, or if you read Deirdre Bloom's NAS paper that covers this, you'll see that that measure is highly sensitive to individuals who start at the top of the income distribution based on their parents' income and then fall slightly lower in their own adulthood. To simplify, this measure strongly puts weight on those who started from a more advantaged position. The measure I'm going to talk about today does the opposite. We're going to give more weight to those starting in the bottom of the distribution. We're going to buy into this conceptual importance of poverty, or at least I'm going to, and you can tell me if you're convinced or not. We're going to follow standard measurement properties in this literature by looking at household income, not personal earnings, not anything at the individual level, but household income, inclusive of taxes and transfers, all household members, not just fathers and sons. And one advantage of using survey data like the PSID, which I'll talk about today, is that we can actually include non-tax filers, which tend to get missed out in tax-based estimates of intergenerational mobility. Finally, one final implication that I'll come back to later, the mechanisms underpinning intergenerational poverty are going to differ from, or they do differ from the mechanisms underpinning other measures of mobility, like rank rate slopes or mobility looking at the broader distribution, and also the policy implications or the strategies for reducing the persistence of disadvantage differ in this framework. And that I'm going to show you taxes and transfers do matter a lot. Again, they would not matter in a framework just focused on positional rank, to an extent. They would not matter to the same extent. That is an introduction to the concept, and now I'm going to present some visuals to help break down the two main components of this measure a little bit more before we start to look at how they are applied in practice. What do we actually see in the data regarding the intergenerational persistence of poverty? So how do its properties differ from other measures? We're going to break down this simple equation that we've looked at already into three main components. And these three main components are the level of the outcome variable, so level of adult poverty rates. Here, we have the level of child poverty, which could potentially matter. I'll show you that. And we have this relative persistence between the two, between childhood poverty and adulthood poverty. There's some implications of this framework that are important to walk through. And the first implication is that when we study beta 1 there in the red box, when we study the intergenerational persistence of poverty, we are not studying child poverty. So when we talk about reducing the intergenerational persistence of poverty, this is quite important, we are not just talking about finding ways to reduce the extent of child poverty. Instead, we are looking at what is your likelihood of being poor in adulthood conditional on a given amount of childhood poverty that one has experienced. So I'm going to try to visualize this to make this extra clear. On the y-axis of this figure is beta 1 from some simulated data. This is the intergenerational persistence of poverty. And on the x-axis is child poverty rates. We varied in the data child poverty rates from 5% to 15%. Kept everything else roughly the same. You can see that the estimates of intergenerational poverty in the simulated data are nearly the same across different levels of childhood poverty at the bottom. That is because, again, the study of intergenerational poverty is really not the same as the study of childhood poverty. And statistically, we can show that that beta 1 that we're looking at does not vary by definition when rates of childhood poverty change. Instead, the intergenerational persistence of poverty is affected by two main features: level of poverty in adulthood and the relative persistence, independent of adult poverty rates, the relative persistence of childhood poverty and adult poverty. And I'm going to visualize this for you again to try to make this super clear because when we talk about variation in intergenerational persistence of poverty, we are going to want to know, is that variation we're finding driven by this, the adult poverty rates, or is it driven by this, that relatively independent of variation in this? So let me start by emphasizing how adult poverty rates come into play here. This is another simulation. On the y-axis, again, is just beta 1. It's the intergenerational persistence of poverty. This time on the x-axis is the adult poverty rate. This is from simulated data. So we varied adult poverty from 0% to 15%. And in this simulation, the relative persistence component is fixed. So it's not changing across these simulations. So when the relative persistence is fixed and adult poverty rates vary, you see that essentially the intergenerational persistence of poverty varies dramatically. When there is no adult poverty, there is no intergenerational persistence of poverty. And that, I would argue, is a feature of this measure, not a bug. It falls to 0 when we've eliminated poverty. At the same time, with a fixed relative persistence, a fixed concentration of adult poverty among those who are also poor in childhood, variation in adult poverty rates affect variation in our estimates of the intergenerational persistence of poverty. So take away from this, adult poverty rates are going to matter when we study variation across countries, when we study variation across time, in understanding intergenerational poverty. But intergenerational poverty at the same time is not solely determined by adult poverty rates, because this other part matters a lot. And I want to show you one more graph from the simulated data to make this clear. Same story. On the y-axis is beta 1, it's the intergenerational persistence of poverty. On the x-axis, now we're varying the adult poverty rate again, just like before. But now the part we changed, it's hard to read the gray numbers, but the point is we changed this component. We changed the relative persistence component. And what you see in this fake data is that the intergenerational persistence of poverty could be identical at different rates of adult poverty if this varies across these runs. All that to say, two main takeaways from understanding this measure that we're going to return to when we look at trends across time in countries is that two main things matter. Number one, these material concerns, how much poverty is there in adulthood among the cohorts that we're looking at? And number two, for a given level of adult poverty, how concentrated is that poverty among those who are also poor in childhood? That's the relative link. When we understand variation in intergenerational poverty across time, we want to know, is it due to this or due to this? And when we study the efficacy of policies in reducing intergenerational poverty. So I won't talk about this much today, but we have a companion paper looking at how the earned income tax credit in the US has affected or not the intergenerational persistence of poverty. And when we do those types of analyses, again, we want to know if a policy has any effect on this measure, is it because of number one or number two? And they have slightly different implications. That's the framework. Now we're going to actually look at some data and understand variation across time in play. And I'm going to start with looking at the US relative to other high-income countries, just to give us a benchmark of how the US compares overall. And then we'll look at trends in the US. This is mostly from a paper that's published already. It's this one with Just Espin-Andersen, Rafael Pinto-Schmidt, and Peter Thallesen. So I'm only going to spend a couple minutes to give you the headline findings of this. And if you want to read more on the paper, it's there. But in this paper, we're focused on, broadly, how do high-income countries compare with respect to the intergenerational persistence of poverty, and what explains any variation that we find. And we use data from the US, the UK, Denmark, Germany, and Australia. For Denmark, we have registered data. For the other four countries, we have panel data that's been harmonized, made comparable by matching income concepts, etc. If you're curious about the data sets, again, this is all in the paper that's online. It's what I just said. So for the UK, we're using the HLS, but also the VHPS, the PSID for the US, and more. I can get into more about the sample and other decisions, but we are looking at individuals who are observed consistently, or at least 5 years during childhood, at least once in adulthood, which we define as ages 25 to 35 here, and we vary that. Maybe one thing I will emphasize, and I'll emphasize this again later, when we measure childhood poverty and adult poverty, We are not just taking a single year. We're not taking a single snapshot. We are averaging over all years of childhood, so we set up to 17 years, and taking each year, poor, non-poor, taking the average of those binary poverty statuses throughout childhood. So if you were poor half of childhood, you get a score of 0.5. Same in adulthood. We are averaging over ages 25 to 35. So to reduce the influence of any single year measurement error or fluctuations. But anyway, what I want to show you is how the US is performing relative to other countries. So right now I'm just graphing the US on the far side. On the y-axis, this is not simulated data, this is real data now. This is the intergenerational persistence of poverty in the US over the full PSID that we're looking at here. That says 0.42. What does that mean? It means roughly that spending all of your childhood in poverty is associated with a 42 percentage point increase in the likelihood of being poor in adulthood relative to someone in the US who faces no childhood poverty, essentially. That's not good. And in fact, if you look at how other countries are performing, the US is really an outlier with respect to the intergenerational persistence of poverty. Australia is 20%, so half the US rate. Denmark, 0.07. Germany, 0.10. It's mostly Western Germany. The UK, this usually surprises people when I present in London, Oxford, or elsewhere, but it's 0.15 in our data. And we can talk maybe in the discussion if you want to dive into that number or understand the implications of the changes to the HLS, etc. What I want you to take away from this is that the US is not doing great. And the rest of this paper explains why. But what I want to do now is go back to the slide we looked at before, and we want to start to know, is the US performing so poorly just because it has higher poverty rates among adults? Or is it because, independent of differences in levels of adult poverty, that relative persistence component just is stronger in the US? And even if poverty rates were equalized across the countries, would the US still perform worse? In other words, asking, is adult poverty more concentrated among those individuals who are also poor in childhood in the US compared to other countries? I'll explain this figure, but that's roughly what we're doing now. So we've dropped Denmark for a minute. The black bars are what you've seen already. That's the intergenerational persistence of poverty. And the green bars now are saying, if the US and all these other countries had the same adult poverty rate as Germany, which is, Germany poverty rates are lower than in the US, so now we've reduced US poverty rates. What would the intergenerational persistence of poverty be? Driven now primarily by variation in that relative persistence component. And that's what the green bars are capturing. So in the US, we started at 0.42. When we've reduced adult poverty rates to match that of Germany, the US has dropped to 0.28. Two things I want you to take away: that 0.28 is notably lower. So a lot of the higher intergenerational persistence poverty in the US is due to its higher poverty rates overall. But even when we perform these complicated reweighting exercises to give everyone Germany's poverty rate, the US still performs worse. Australia is now at 0.21, UK is even lower. By definition, Germany hasn't changed, suggesting that, again, independent of levels of adult poverty, that relative persistence component is it's higher in the US than in other countries. That is benchmarking the US relative to other countries. Now we want to understand, when we use the longitudinal component of this data, has the US made any progress? And I want to preface what I'm going to show you by telling you that the US has made progress in reducing child poverty rates in the last 3 or 4 decades. We've had moments of extreme progress, 2020, 2021, exceptional years. But in general, the trend in child poverty, according to most measures that people in the US like to use at least, we have made progress. So have we made progress in reducing the intergenerational persistence of poverty is what I'm asking now. I'm going to use the PSID, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, same as before, using data from 1970 to 2019. The PSID is survey data. It's not registered data. And so it suffers from the usual concerns of, or potentially suffers from the usual concern of survey-based panel data. You have attrition, people dropping out of the sample. You need to be concerned with whether you have a good measure of income. And spent a lot of time up front in this paper in progress trying to be sure that PSID is good enough to do what we're going to ask of it. And I'm going to go through these 3 slides quickly, but the takeaway is that I'm pretty convinced that it's good enough to do what we want, and I'll try to explain why briefly. On key measures, we're going to measure poverty, again, using post-tax transfer household income. SNAP benefits, if you're familiar with these in the US, we count them. That's food stamps. Earned income tax credit, it gives you a big chunk of money at tax time. We count that. It's all in there. In most of the findings I show you today, I'm going to use what we refer to as an absolute poverty line. It's the official poverty measure. It's not a great way to measure poverty, but it doesn't. It's the upshot of this. We're going to use it for now, and I can show you 50% of median or other measures as well. We're going to measure the average poverty rate for a person during their childhood. So we're taking average poverty exposure from birth to age 17. And in adulthood, we're looking at ages 28 to 38, and we can vary this. Again, this is not the same as taking poverty at a single point in time. We are averaging over multiple years. Can we be sure that the income data in the PSID are, let's say, good enough, and good enough relative to maybe the gold standard survey data, which is the current population survey, or registered data? And I think it's good enough, and I'll explain my concern. My concern would be that taxes and transfers are not appropriately reflected in the PSID. That would matter when we measure poverty like we're trying to do. So we have 2 ways of approaching this. One is to use some off-the-shelf measures from the CNEF, Cross-National Equivalent Files. It's a group at Ohio State University that's put in a lot of effort to produce high-quality income concepts in the US data, but also in the UK, Australia, etc. So one, I just use what they have. But second, I run my own imputations of taxes and transfers, bringing in data from a better survey that more accurately captures some information, matching on certain characteristics and the data. And I don't want to spend too much time on this other than to tell you that I'm pretty sure it works fine and we don't need to worry about it. So happy to come back to this later if you want to talk about measurement. What about attrition? I'm just going to tell you for now that I don't think it affects the results all that much. You can do some reweighting to try to account for this and other techniques. Attrition does occur in the PSID, but I don't think it's affecting the measure that we're looking at all that much. So happy to come back to that later if you want to hear more about what exactly we've done on this. Instead, I just want to show you some findings, and we'll do this in a couple ways. Relative to the other graphs I've shown you that have a longitudinal component, this one is different in that the x-axis is birth year. So it's not calendar year, it's birth year, and we're capturing poverty rates around age 30, so age 28 to 38. So when you see someone in 1960, that means they were born then. They will turn 30 roughly in 1990, is what you keep in mind. For now, this is just purely descriptive trends. It's adult poverty rates across birth cohorts for 2 groups. Right now, it's just very simply showing you those who never experienced childhood poverty in the red triangles, and those who did experience some child poverty. For now, it's just very simple, whether it was 1 year or 17 years. And what you see for really both of these, but especially the blue circles here, is that among those who experience some child poverty, we are seeing a decline in adult poverty rates from about 1960s cohort to the 1968 cohort. But after that, overall exposure to poverty in adulthood has been relatively flat across the 2 groups. This is the main measure of the intergenerational persistence of poverty. It's a simplified form. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but this is beta 1. This is trends in intergenerational poverty in the US. And what you see, well, if you start with the 1960s cohort, you have an intergenerational persistence of poverty of about 0.35. If you go all the way to the 1988 cohort, we've dropped to 0.29. And if you believe in these confidence intervals, you would really not make any difference in the point estimates between 1960 and 1988 cohorts.
Just a question of clarification. So poverty post and child poverty are measured as number of years in poverty or share? A share of the total period.
So in both cases, in childhood, everyone has a score from 0% to 100%, 0 to 1. And if you were poor 8 of your 16 observed childhood years, you were at 0.5. So we are getting both it's not a count because people are observed at Some are observed 8 years, some are observed 12 years. We don't want that to factor in. So it's of the observed years, what share of those years were you poor? And same in adulthood.
And the number of years in adulthood and poverty is the same, the total number.
The number of years in adulthood, we're looking at ages 28 to 38, and we are again taking the share. So it's always bounded by 0 and 1, but it's continuous within there based on the percent of years in a given time period that you are in poverty.
Rebellion, chronic poverty.
And this is not great. The U.S. we looked at cross nationally was not performing well. Here we have a couple ebbs and flows. Maybe we'll talk about this. Hopefully not, because I haven't had time to fully understand what's happening here actually. But in general, what you see is stability more so than some long run decline. This is a busy graph. Well, all I want to do is convince you that this is not just an artifact of how I measure poverty. So I put in 6 different ways of measuring poverty, something called the supplemental poverty measure, something called the official poverty measure, pre-tax transfer, resources in adulthood, etc. All of these lines tell a roughly similar story. And so I'm convinced this is not just about the particular poverty threshold that we're using. This is what this graph would say. So remember, we have these 2 components. We have variation in adult poverty rates that could be driving this trend, or variation in that relative persistence component. And here we're simply decomposing these by reweighting the adult poverty rates across birth cohorts to roughly match the 1960 to 65 rates. So now we are neutralizing variation in adult poverty so that everything that remains is that relative persistence. The contribution of changes in adult poverty rates to intergenerational poverty is this red line at the bottom. So, from 1970 relative to the baseline, adult poverty had fell. That would have led all else equal to lower intergenerational poverty. That blue line is just capturing the relative persistence part when adult poverty rates are equalized across countries. What I want you to take away from this is that that blue line in particular has been flat, suggesting the relative persistence of poverty, that relative link between childhood poverty and adult poverty has been roughly stable in the US, even if there have been some ebbs and flows in the share of people who were just poor in adulthood. And in fact, any progress the US might have made in the 1985 to 1988 cohorts was probably driven by declining poverty rates and not by any improvement in that relative link or the concentration of poverty and adulthood among those who were also poor in the 70s. This relative stability does mask some potentially interesting divergences and trends when you look at specific subgroups. So for now, I'm just going to show you 2 of these. I'm going to show you men and women, and I'll show you Black individuals and white individuals. So this is the same graph as this. We've decomposed. The black line is overall intergenerational poverty. The red line is variation due to poverty rates, and the blue dashed line is that relative persistence component. Here, depending on maybe where you censor your data and where you decide to start looking at trends, from about 1972 until the end of this time period for men on this side, the point estimates at least have declined, maybe signaling some progress among men and that link between childhood poverty and adult poverty. Now, I wouldn't put too much weight into these confidence intervals are still wide, etc. But the point estimate, at least, is pretty consistent in declining. For women, we really don't see anything like that. The rates for women on average are higher, but again, not meaningfully so in some specific years. For Black individuals and white individuals, you see a bit more divergence in recent decades. So here we have white individuals, here we have Black individuals. Same thing. On average, no, let me skip that. If you look at trends in recent decades, from the 1977 cohort onward, for white individuals, you do appear to see some progress in that link between childhood poverty and adulthood poverty, again, among just white individuals there. And on the far side, you see a different story for Black individuals. Now, poverty rates overall have declined more for Black individuals in the US, and this red line going down is telling you that improvements in poverty among Black individuals have all else equal led to a lower intergenerational persistence of poverty among that group. But you see this blue line that's shooting up even higher. The relative link between childhood poverty and adult poverty has perhaps gotten even worse over some of this time period. These are the baseline findings I want to show you. And what I want to do with the final, let's say, 10 minutes or 7 or 8 minutes is to, number one, understand what's behind this, but with the goal of saying, if you want this line to go down, if you want to sever that link between childhood poverty and adult poverty, what do the data offer you in terms of clues of how you could do that? So that's the goal of these final slides I'm going to show you. The simplest way to reduce the intergenerational persistence poverty, and the most boring, which I'm not going to talk about it more, is just to reduce poverty rates in adulthood through taxes and transfers. If you had, you had a magic wand and you eliminated poverty among adults through universal basic income at this level, great. Intergenerational poverty is gone. It's not realistic. It's not really fun to talk on. So instead, I'm going to focus on how can we make progress here in this relative persistence component. Both matter, clearly. The US should do more with taxes and transfers, but I'm going to use the rest of my time to really focus on this just for, let's say, the intellectual game. When we break out this relative persistence component, I in paper argue that there's 3 main things you can focus on. What's the role of family background or other features of your parents beyond just poverty status? And could they matter above and beyond child poverty? So parental education, parental employment, both parents present, and could variation in some of these family background characteristics help to understand variation across time? We're going to measure this very simply, get the role of these family background characteristics in a very simple mediation model. We have our main coefficient of the intergenerational persistence of poverty. We see how that changes when we add in family background characteristics, and the difference between beta 1 and alpha 1 gives us some indicator of the extent to which that relationship is being captured here. So I'm going to go through this part quickly to show you findings, but I'm happy to come back to it in the discussion. That's family background. We could also focus on what we call adulthood mediators. So this link between childhood poverty and adult poverty could be driven through things like your education, your employment, your family structure, your health, that are both linked to childhood poverty. For example, if you grow up poor, all else equal, probably you're going to be less likely to go to LSE. And of course, these variables we can measure, education, employment, and family structure, they pay off with respect to poverty. If you went to LSE relative to not attending any university, probably you have lower poverty rates in adulthood LSE, all else equal. So mediators, technically, we're getting the combination of beta 1 and beta 2. We're capturing both access and returns at once. But what I want you to take away is that we can try to measure how much this matters in our story. Differential access across time to education or employment, and differential returns to it as well. And finally, there's going to be a residual that says, even after we capture our mediators and our family background characteristics, we brought in taxes and transfers, there might be some unexplained association between childhood poverty and adult poverty. They could also vary across time, and they could matter in the story. This is essentially a black box of unmeasured factors that could affect this relationship that we can't measure in our data set, or we don't measure. So what I'm going to show you is a simple graph. I think it's simple, that the empty bars here represent what we've already seen. So this is not new. The bars represent the intergenerational persistence of poverty by birth cohort. We're going to fill in these bars with the different factors we've talked about to understand in a given year, to what extent is intergenerational poverty accounted for by, let's say, family background characteristics. And then we can just see changes in the role of this light blue family background part over time to start to get some sense of whether variation in, let's say, who your parents were, independent of their income, matters for the trends that we're observing. So I hope that's clear. We're going to fill the rest of this bar in with mediators and the residual in a moment. But to takeaway number one is that changes in family background, parental education, when your mother was born, both parents' presence, etc., these matter for many reasons, but variation in this doesn't appear to explain a lot of the fluctuations in intergenerational poverty in the US. So I don't think it's a major part of the story that we're looking at. We're going to add to that our now dark blue bars. These are adult mediators. And you start to see most of these bars being filled, especially in some years, the 1976 cohort. What this means is that adult mediators, again, education, employment, and family structure, tend to explain a large share of the intergenerational persistence of poverty. And you have some variation in that explanatory power is through causal, but you know what I mean, across cohorts. If you look at this and you think we've captured family background, we've captured mediators, there's still some empty space in these bars. What's left, that's our residual term, and that's the orange now. And this residual is the unexplained variation. And here you also see, unfortunately, in some years, a big role of the residual, but also fluctuation across time. And one implication of this, if you're looking at the 1988 cohort and you want to reduce intergenerational poverty, what we observe in the data about selection into employment, family structure, etc., you address all that and it still might not be enough to get this down to zero because that orange bar is something else here is unexplained. I'm going to close with, I think, like 2 more slides. And what I want to do is, if our implication is that these mediators probably matter a lot, what specifically? Is it employment? Is it education? Is it family structure matters? Again, with the goal of saying, if we want to get this measure down, what practically do we need to focus on? So what I'm going to show you at the top is the baseline intergenerational persistence of poverty, now just lumping all years together. And these different bars below are giving you a counterfactual, purely descriptive intergenerational poverty after essentially removing the mediation effect of a given indicator. So if we take out the mediating role of employment and intergenerational poverty goes way down, that's what happens, that is telling us that in this framework, employment seems to matter a lot in shaping intergenerational poverty. In reality, it's because there's large selection effects into who is employed, especially at high work intensity, among those who were born into poverty versus those who are not. If that's not clear, it will be in a couple of slides, but what I'm going to emphasize here from this slide is that employment dominates. If we were to address the unequal selection into employment, in other words, if individuals with high rates of poverty exposure were employed in adulthood at the same rate as individuals with no poverty exposure, intergenerational persistence of poverty would go down quite a bit, and more so, roughly, than if we address differences in parental education, their own family structure in adulthood, which of course still matters. You see it's lower than the baseline up there. Parental family structure, your own education, and more. I'll just highlight own education. In the broader mobility literature, education dominates. In the intergenerational persistence of poverty, specifically employment, tends to dominate over education. And that's one of the, I started the talk with telling you that some of the mechanisms are going to differ in this framework versus others. And this is one clear implication. And this is consistent across the work I've done on this, that employment tends to matter a bit more. Can I show you one more slide? What's going on with employment? And why do we see this gap here? How do we further crack this open and really wrap our heads around what's going on in this story? That's the goal of this final slide. What I'm showing you now is purely descriptive. There's going to be 3 groups at the bottom: people who have low exposure to childhood poverty, medium, and high, all relative to a group that never experienced childhood poverty. And what I'm showing you now is on the y-axis is simply the gap in employment rates, with basic controls, adding some more controls, and adding controls for education. So this is the raw gap in employment rates. Let's focus on this group. For individuals who experienced 3/4 or more of their childhood in poverty, relative to individuals who did not experience poverty, what are the differences in employment rates in adulthood? The unadjusted difference here in blue is 22.5 percentage points, approximately. That's a massive gap in the likelihood of being employed, and actually being employed, among those who experienced high levels of childhood poverty relative to those who did not face any childhood poverty. And that's largely driving what I showed you a couple slides back. Is that simply due to this group having lower education on average? Interestingly, no. So when we account for own education, the adjusted gap here is about 15 percentage points. Smaller, of course, than the baseline, but still quite substantial, suggesting this is not just about individuals facing high poverty it's not just about their own education. This is independent of their education relative to others. There is a penalty for having experienced a lot of child poverty through other mechanisms that we might talk about. Is that clear? Okay. I'm not showing you in this one, but you could add another control for state of residence, and it doesn't matter. So this is not just a geographic story either. So let me try to make sense of everything we've seen so far and give you what I think are the main takeaways here. I'm arguing, and I really welcome your feedback if you disagree, that the intergenerational persistence of poverty is distinct from other mobility metrics that we often use, measuring intergenerational earnings or income elasticities, particularly when measuring those across full income distribution, different than rank slopes in many ways, still different than just using transition matrices on top of your rank slopes, still different than producing estimates of absolute income mobility for reasons I've talked about. There are different properties. I argue that there's greater welfare consequences in general for focusing on this measure relative to some of the companion measures. We have a stronger income concept, and we're combining two things at once: these distributional concerns about how many people are in poverty with the fairness considerations. So if you are born poor, independent of adult poverty rates, do you stay poor? The US does not do very well on this indicator. It trails other high-income countries, partially due to its higher poverty rates overall, as we saw. But even when we adjusted those poverty rates in adulthood, the US stood out due to a stronger relative persistence between childhood poverty and adult poverty. And the US has made very little progress in recent decades, unfortunately. Despite plenty of policy change, intergenerational poverty has been roughly flat with some ebbs and flows in the US across 30 plus birth cohorts. What could the US do if it wanted to reduce the intergenerational persistent poverty? The easy route that we talked about is just reduce adult poverty rates through whatever mechanism. We know that matters. But could it also address that relative persistence component? If so, how? And we learned at the end of this presentation that employment and differential access to employment, and full-time employment especially, seems to be driving a lot of the results that we're looking at. That independent of even your own education, if you grew up with a lot of poverty relative to none, we just see really large differences in employment rates in adulthood that are driving a lot of these findings. What to do about that? I don't know. We can talk about it. But that, I believe, is underpinning the relationships that we're looking at. So we need more research on all of these elements: measurement properties, understanding variation, understanding which policies are effective. And that's what we're trying to do, part of what we're trying to do at our team at INET and NUCLE as well. Let me close by just saying this is a paper that we're working on, trying to make progress on, trying to get real criticism and feedback on. So I really welcome any thoughts you have, disagreements, etc., on what I've showed. So thanks a lot.